Now to something completely different. I feel a little bit like the odd man out here. You guys have been talking about banking, technical, and fintech, and so forth. My topic is really sort of the big picture, China, what's happening, and it's not, the usual macro stuff. There will be some of that, but it's more about, in my case, it's about globalization and whether, China is, a credible standard bearer of this globalization. I wonder if I need to walk through. I was planning to do like Mick Jagger, run all over the place, but maybe I don't need to do that. I just settled for these two areas. Anyway, I would say for the last year or so, the Communist Party General Secretary, as well as the President of China, his name is Xi Jinping, he has been portraying himself as a champion of globalization. He has been, into big events like G20, which is the picture on the left, on your left. That's with the BRICS country presidents. He was at the World Economic Forum in the beginning of this year. And actually, just yesterday, there was another big event in Beijing, which was about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a big globalization initiative by China, which also was a lot of state leaders and representatives. In all these three events, the president and the party secretary, Communist Party secretary, has been talking about globalization. I think that's kind of interesting since, let's say in the Western world, in the US and in Europe certainly, there's been a lot of, I would say, anti-globalization, more of a nationalistic, make America great and so forth. So China is sort of stepping into the void, trying to, take up the topics which the West used to be the champion of. By the way, when I talk about globalization in this context, I mean it's such a wide concept. But in this particular one, I will exclude geopolitical considerations. So I will not talk about power politics or such. Next picture. So this definition I found on the internet, and this is, I think it serves my purpose well. So it's a worldwide movement towards economic, financial, trade, communication, integration. Globalization implies the opening of local and nationalistic perspectives to a broader outlook of an interconnected and interdependent world, with free transfer of capital, goods, services across national frontiers. I think that serves at least my presentation very well. I will try to do like a pros and cons in this presentation, because my sort of topic is a question mark at the end. Is China a credible champion? Can we believe, or are they just trying to serve themselves? Because it has served China very well. I would say the ultimate goal of economic growth is the creation of, maybe not of wealth, but the creation of a good everyday life for everybody. That is the ultimate goal of all economic activities. And since China embarked on the open door policy, their story is unbelievable. I mean, here is really the eradication of poverty in China. Back in early 80s, there were around 800 million poor people in China. And the definition is then, I use the World Bank definition, which is less than $2 a day per person. That is a definition of poverty. If you are above that, then you are not considered to be poor. In China, actually, they have a slightly different definition. It's a little bit less. It's about $1 a day. And the goal currently, or has been for a couple of years, is that China, the president and the party secretary, Mr. Xi Jinping, he wants to eradicate poverty by 2020. So 3 years later, there should be no poor people. And here you can see the development, and this is really a huge success story. There's some blips, there are some, but it's fairly stable all the way down. And I would say that the goal of eradicating poverty in China it looks quite feasible. So far, they have pulled around 700 million people out of poverty, and a couple of million remain. Right now, they are moving people out from poverty at a clip of 12 million a year. 12 million people a year are being brought out of poverty. The main drivers are economic development, of course, growth, which is because of investments, but also trade. But also urbanization is very, very important in this story. When they move people from the countryside into the cities, you will have the creation of some sort of well-being. So here I come to why we shouldn't consider China a credible champion of globalization. China is running really aggressive, has been running aggressive industrial policy or development policy since the early 80s. And I would say industrial policies really hurdles. It's limiting access to the market by various ways. So in the beginning of the 80s, or during the 80s, if foreigners wanted to invest in China, they had to do it with a Chinese partner, and they could not hold a majority stake in the company. They had to do joint venture, and they had to be max 50% owner. This changed a bit in the 90s, and then they introduced a catalog where you could invest, where it says what you can invest in and what you cannot invest in. So basically a list of things where you could go or where you could not go. They also introduced this deal, which has been going on ever since. Foreigners are welcome. They are expected to transfer technology, and in return, they get market access. This is still the deal. I think a big game changer for China was when they acceded to the WTO. That led to general relaxation. Trading became allowed from foreign companies. Previously, they can only sell their own products which they made in China. Suddenly, they can do trading. But transfer of technology was still around. Now, in the last couple of years, they have been reducing these areas where you cannot invest in as a foreigner. And they have what they call a negative list. Now they are even discussing, investment agreements, bilateral such, with the European Union and with the US. That will be the final stage of market access. So industrial policy has served China well, but it makes also China not so credible. Now, I would like to show you, and maybe this is a good venue because this is about the digital world. But this is a typical, glorious example of how China has done in respect to industrial policy. In China, Google is not allowed. It's blocked. eBay is not allowed. Amazon is not allowed. WhatsApp, Instagram, PayPal, Apple Pay, Twitter cannot be accessed. They have their own clones. They have their own copies. So Google in China is Baidu. eBay and Amazon is Taobao and JD.com. WhatsApp and Instagram is WeChat, and Alipay is Apple Pay and PayPal and so forth. Twitter is Weibo. So they have their own, service providers, and these companies are massive. And they have been able to grow massive because those international companies from Silicon Valley was not allowed in. this is a great success. If you look at anywhere else in the world, do we have these do we have contenders to Google, eBay, WeChat, and Twitter? Nowhere else, I believe. And in China, we have them because those global players were not allowed in. Typical industrial policy in play. Also, when we look at surveys regarding China, this is also a case why China is not credible as a global champion. Amcham, which is the American chamber, Eurocham is the European chamber in China. They are doing these yearly surveys. And in the last survey, which is a really scary number for China, 70% of European companies feel less welcome now than they did 10 years ago. For the American companies, it's 80%. They don't feel welcome as they were 10 years ago. And the reason is what they call non-tariff barriers. It's basically policies which favor, Chinese companies before foreign companies. And these kind of policies all over the place. And not necessarily are they condoned by Beijing, but they are instituted by provincial governments, local governments. China is a huge country, and Beijing does not control everybody. So these kind of sort of anti-foreign investor policies are all over the place, and that is the reason why companies from Europe and US feel less welcome. So they talk about unclear regulations, inconsistent enforcement. So some rules, they only apply for foreign companies, such as environmental rules. They never go after Chinese companies. They always go after foreign companies. Internet is hopeless in China, especially cross-border. Global gateways are horrible, and this is because of the big China firewall. They are filtering, and they are having blocked words, which makes international internet extremely slow. On the other hand, for these companies, China still is a top investment destination, and they still earn good money, even though the margins are not as good. But this also shows that, well, maybe not such a good champion of globalization. Foreign trade, again. The darker line here is Chinese exports, and the lighter blue line is Chinese imports. And you can see consistently the last 15 years, China is having surpluses, trade surpluses, fairly massive such surpluses. I think on a monthly basis, it's 30 to 40 billion US that they export more than they import. Then, of course, certain people say China is a currency manipulator. They are sort of making the currency weaker than it should be in order to make Chinese companies more competitive. I don't really agree on that, but maybe 5 years ago it was like that, but maybe not anymore. But one fact which I find is very important here is that of Chinese exports, more than 50% of those exports are done from companies which are foreign-owned. So in a way, when you talk about this globalized world, bilateral trade balance is making less and less sense. I mean, if a US company in China is exporting to the US, should that be calculated as a Chinese trade surplus? Sort of the ownership is very important here. But anyway, China's foreign trade is an interesting story. They have consistently exported much more than they are importing. So, China has benefited from globalization. The question is, does the foreign companies or countries benefit from globalization? That's really the question here. I'd like to talk about this since this meeting Sunday and Monday, 2 days ago, was about Belt and Road. This one is this is an initiative by the Chinese President Xi Jinping, and it was introduced 3 years ago, and it's basically a project to connect the world, at least along the old Silk Road and along the waterways from China through the Straits of Malacca over to Africa, through Red Sea to the Mediterranean. So this is really to connect 65 countries along these routes. And in my opinion, it's a giant peace process as well. By doing this, they hope to start economic activity, create growth, bring people out of poverty, and also reduce, these instability in the Stan countries and try to create a more peaceful world. The problem, I think, for China is that all these roads starts in China. So they are sort of guilty by association. There is a lot of suspicion about this project, but the money is there. They have 3 banks who are basically dedicated. It's the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing, where they have some 50, 60 countries. Finland is in there. They have their own Silk Road fund, and they have this new development fund, which is a BRICS bank. Yesterday, the president said that he will commit another 113 billion US. There's a lot of money which are allocated to this project. And to fill in the gap of infrastructure is roads, power, telecom. There will be a lot of opportunities for Finnish companies in this project. And you would have Finvera, you would have export credits. So this is something which I recommend you guys to keep, your eye on this thing. And this is something which makes China a credible champion of globalization, I would say. Even though there is some suspicion about geopolitical power play. Of course, they want to bring these countries into their sphere of interest. This is a story which I heard a little bit about earlier. China used to be a receiver of capital. Foreign companies were investing in China. They have been doing so since the middle 80s. So far, they have attracted 1.7 trillion US of investments from overseas. But as you see, Chinese outflow in 2014 was larger than the inflow. So China is now an exporter of capital to Finland, to Europe, to the United States. Again, this is a case for China as a credible, champion of globalization. Now they have earned a lot of money. Now they will deploy them. They will deploy them in Finland, in other countries. They will start new companies. They will buy existing companies. Certainly, this makes China a believable, champion of globalization. And this probably you have seen already. Chinese groups, tourist groups, will be everywhere in Finland. Even in the smallest place, there will be a bus coming up with a group of Chinese. The interesting thing is that they are spending much more than anybody else. They are spending more than double per day and per head than Russian tourists does. And this is creating jobs in Finland, in France, everywhere. And the numbers are staggering. In the next 5 years, there will be another 700 million trips made by Chinese people. 700 million trips in the next 5 years. So more than like 120, 130 every year. And as I said, they are spending a hell of a lot of money. This is like Chinese imports, basically, because they are consuming services. They are buying hotel nights, they are buying luxury goods, they are eating food, So certainly this is a benefit. This is an interesting one, also in connection with today's topic. China is really into e-commerce. They are probably buying, of all countries in the world, Chinese are the ones who have adopted e-commerce the most. They are buying everything: toilet paper, toothpaste, food, whatever. And now they are starting to buy from the world. So they are sitting with their smartphone somewhere in China, and they are ordering reindeer meat from some farmer up in the north of Finland. This is highly possible. And you see the numbers. Last year they were buying for 85 billion US. And this is, as they call it, the fastest growing consumer segment in the world. And they are hooked up with their smartphones and they are buying stuff, like crazy. And the platforms they are using is Tmall Global, JD Worldwide. These are Chinese platforms. They are paying with WeChat. They are paying through Alipay, Chinese payment platforms. Jack Ma, he visited Donald Trump, and he promised 1 million US jobs to him. And this is highly believable, because the way they are shopping, it will create jobs. Even though Chinese are not even there, it will create jobs for US citizens. So I would say this is probably the strongest case for China being a champion of globalization. And these numbers are just increasing. And as you can see, currently there are 300 million consumers on the internet buying stuff through e-commerce platforms. 5 years from now, it's double, 600 million. And they are buying everything. Fruit from the US, they are buying, all kinds of stuff. Milk powder from Finland, maybe, Could be anything. So, what I would recommend you is to educate yourself about these names. Alipay, of course, is owned by Alibaba, which is Jack Ma's company. It's a payment solution. Now they have made strategic alliances in the US. UnionPay is like a card acquirer, just like Visa or MasterCard. I'm sure they are in Finland, UnionPay. They are like a competitor to MasterCard and Visa. WeChat is probably the world's largest e-purse or purse which you use when you buy stuff in the internet. Chinese normally use WeChat, where they collect their money. Now the platforms for sales is JD.com, as I said, Taobao. Alibaba is more for Finnish companies to showcase their products for the Chinese public. So Alibaba is like a massive mall or a massive place to sell B2B. And also Weibo is WeChat, which then you can market your stuff. So in conclusion, is China a believable or a credible champion for globalization? Well, I think the jury is still out. In respect to their, industrial policy or development policy, I think there are still questions to be asked. They are being a protectionist. On the other hand, with the new economy coming, and also the sheer size of China, it sort of becomes in itself, China becomes in itself, or despite itself, it becomes a credible champion for globalization. And China is a stakeholder, as you saw in the beginning there. They have benefited massively from globalization, and they are aware of the problems with it. In the speech in Davos, in this World Economic Forum, I think Mr. Xi Jinping, the president, was very eloquent. He's aware of the problems, inequality, the 1% having and the 99% not having and all that. So he's aware of that changes needs to be done, but also he puts the money where his mouth is, which is then this, the project, the Belt and Road Initiative, where actually Finland is sort of on the outskirts. I'm sure Finland will be involved in this, like Finvera, like export credits. Kone will have good business. Certainly, Cargotec, because they are building ports and loading stations, container terminals at railways and so forth. So to give China the benefit of the doubt, I put my vote in saying yes, China is probably a credible champion for globalization, and it is a huge stakeholder. That's it.
Thanks, Johan. You see, Handelsbanken is having a form how to make bankers, uniform and tie and hair and everything. Do you mind if I ask you one question?
Please.
I was just thinking that as with the headline of today is money and fintech. So in short, how do you see China and fintech? What's kind of a next step?
I think China, I heard earlier in the morning, China was not given their fair share of credit in respect to fintech, because fintech in China is huge. As usual for these developing countries, they are jumping over steps, which we sort of, in our very slow industrialization phase, we have gone through all these steps, and China is jumping over certain steps, like they did in mobile telephony. They never owned a fixed line telephone. They went straight for this mobile phone. This tend to be with banking as well. So you have huge Chinese fintech companies. So in the life insurance or in the insurance space, there is a pretty big one, which is called Lufax. You might check it out. They are selling insurance over the internet, very successful. They had this WeChat purse, where people are buying through the internet. And coupled with this WeChat purse, you have like money market funds where you can place money, those monies which you are not using. You can have a good, you can have a good interest rate on it. Yeah. Suddenly you have these money market funds. So I would say China is a fairly interesting fintech market, actually.
Sounds like it, and a lot of us will learn. Hey, thank you, Johan.
Thank
you.
It
was a pleasure to hear you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for coming.